All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for watching. This is the first episode of Rounding the Earth. My name is Mathew Crawford, and I'm here today with guest Charles Platt. And Charles and I met online having conversations just a few months ago. And he is, well, at least I know of him as a technical writer who writes about electronics and how to make them. And he is sitting in front of a lot of electronic parts right now, it looks like. But Charles, I'll let you introduce yourself further because I suppose I don't know your entire career.
Mhm. It's important to understand in this conversation, I'm not a scientist, but I used to be a science journalist for Wired magazine. And I met a lot of scientists in the course of my work. And a lot of us have a sense that scientists are almost religious in the sense they're questing for truth. And I think that's true in many cases, but not all. And there's a spectrum of purity, shall we say, in any profession. People are motivated by different things, some of them including money. And I met some scientists certainly who were concerned about their reputation, their future grant money, and this affected them as people. So whenever we're dealing with something like COVID-19 and we're reading testimony from experts, you have to bear in mind that there is a spectrum of trust and trustworthiness. And I think that's, in a way, something I've noticed in your posts, that you gradually started to think maybe not everyone in this field is quite as trustworthy as I thought. And
And if I could
am I right
interject
about that?
here, if I could interrupt for just a moment, I'm going to go ahead and create some context for the audience, which is that Charles and I got to know each other over discussions about medication being used or not being used during the COVID-19 crisis, and in particular, we talked a lot about hydroxychloroquine, but there are also other medicines that look to be, in my opinion. Um, Very reasonable medications, very effective. Ivermectin has a number of positive studies that are out. Vitamin D, vitamin C have some positive studies that look like these can be therapies for people. Zinc as well, and a few others. There are numerous, and so this frames the context of the conversation that we're having today.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the question is, which I really am putting to you, is did you go through a process of gradual, shall we say, enlightenment, or did you find what you were expecting to find? Did you go on a quest? And did you get to a conclusion?
um, so from the very beginning, the entire discussion seemed very strange to me. Of course, Trump comes out and he mentions hydroxychloroquine, and suddenly there's just a media frenzy about it. And it seemed very unnatural to me, right? And it seemed, but at first I just chalked it up to, the media is going to say something negative about Trump every time he breathes or every time he says anything. Um, he could say that it is a bad idea to drown puppies, and I think that there would be people who would argue vehemently in favor of it. But it felt very strange. But then when I saw, friends, on social media, and some doctors, some scientists seem to act very obtusely over it. I, I started to look at all the medical research, and I started to talk to doctors and researchers at different places around the world. My wife is a professional researcher. She's a biochemist. She's done bioterrorism work. She's done cancer research, genetics, epigenetics research. Um, so I have a fair number of science contacts, but really a lot of former students, because I helped run a school online that's had hundreds of thousands of students, many of which I've known for now, 17 years or longer. It seems like the plurality of them seem to be doctors and scientists. And so I have contacts in different countries around the world. And when I would, some of those would reach out to me. I didn't even reach out to them at first. They would reach out to me and go, "This is very strange. Where I'm in India, or where I am in Vietnam, everybody's using this. And we have no idea why this is controversial, except that it surrounds Trump." So, by May, I think, maybe early May, I was really starting to keep up with all of the research that would come out. And then in late May, when the Surgisphere study came out, this was a big moment for me. And I'm curious about when it was that you got into this, and I'll turn the question back to you in a moment. But the moment I looked at the Surgisphere study, I thought this is a fake, and I couldn't believe that something of that magnitude would look so bad on face. And it shocked me so much that I went for a walk with my wife that night after just it was just overwhelming just weirdness about this. And I told her, the study came out, and I think it's fake. And she said, well, why do you think it's fake? So I walked through, the statistics that I saw that were in the study. The number of people taking hydroxychloroquine versus chloroquine didn't look like it could possibly be right. The fact they said 53% of COVID patients in the study were men didn't seem right, because I had seen, 60% from all over the world, right? That's what the numbers seemed to hover around, was that 60% of men were COVID patients. But there were all these different stats that looked like they had close to zero variance, right? That they were just, just barely any noise among them. And I thought, this is just too good to be true over 6 continents with 600
Maybe you should just
hospitals.
explain. Maybe you should just explain variance for a moment.
Yeah, just deviation from a baseline is probably the easiest way for a layperson to understand it. You should see a whole lot of noise within numbers until they are just at magnificent quantity, to become imperceptible. I didn't believe the study, and the fact that it claimed that those taking hydroxychloroquine and chloroquine were something like, there are different numbers attached to this, right? But anywhere from like 30 something percent to 50 something percent more likely to die. I knew from all my contacts around the world, that's not what they were seeing. Right. And it would have to have been, if there's some places where people were dying less, then that would mean that in other places, people were dying twice as much. And it didn't fit the profile of this medication, which is that it's been taken, in tens of billions of doses at the very least for decades with hardly any kind of a problem. And the study specifically said with or without a macrolide, meaning with or without, probably in most cases, azithromycin. And for that kind of an effect to happen, that would mean that hydroxychloroquine was interacting with the virus in a way that would be just absolutely unprecedented. So I didn't believe the study on day one. And that was a moment for me that said something is very, very wrong. So I'm going to flip back to you, because you and I did not meet until after that point. Because at some point I was motivated enough to start an online community for discussion about the research and try to bring in as many scientists and doctors, but anybody who was interested in the discussion. So I don't know if we met online, perhaps July or August. I can't remember when I started the community, but what was it about everything that you saw that brought you to a conclusion that something seems wrong with this picture?
Well, first of all, although I began by basically saying there may be issues of integrity, let me turn this around now and say there are also, almost certainly, a lot of very sincere people who feel so strongly they may just bend the rules a little bit, not because they lack integrity, but because they feel they have a lot. And you see this a lot in pseudoscience. Someone is trying to prove the existence of telepathy, for instance, and he keeps doing these trials, and the results aren't quite right, but he really, really, really believes in what he's doing. And so just for today, we'll fudge the numbers a little bit. This happens. There's absolutely no doubt. And it can be for sincere motives. Now, unfortunately, we had a very polarizing president who polarized some people very strongly in favor and others very strongly against. So you started off with a very peculiar situation where a press conference was reported, not entirely accurately, and it created such a huge response. At that point, I didn't know what to think was going on. Coincidentally, I know a biophysicist who's a smart guy, who I respect, good scientist. I've known him 30 years. And he had already figured out on his own that hydroxychloroquine might be effective because he read the study that was done in vitro in 2005 on a coronavirus. And he then figured out on his own that you could find this stuff in fish tank cleaner. And he then figured out what the proper dosage would be, which unfortunately, the people in Phoenix who actually tried it didn't figure out the proper dosage. So now you had another factor which completely made the situation unprecedented because it became an exercise in public relations. And I'm sure some scientists were quite outraged that the president had thrown these ideas out, and they wanted to disprove them because possibly they felt they were saving lives by doing so. So there are so many unknowns here. And getting back to your question, I certainly agree that some of the studies were very confusing at the very least. And the one that really bothered me the most was the notorious one published in The Lancet, in which they seem to go out of their way to insert cases in the study which were guaranteed to have bad results because they included all the people who died. I mean, and had not been given the drug in the early stages of the disease, which is what you're supposed to do. And they must have known that because the French research was easy to find. So what was going on? Well, we'll never really know, I think, but it did suggest to me that nothing is 100% trustworthy at this point, which is a very strange position to be in when you cannot trust a journal such as The Lancet, which has been around for, I think, more than 100 years. You've got a problem here, you know? So that was the situation I was in mentally when I got into touch with you.
Yeah. So was that the VA study that you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That was frustrating to look through. Actually, I think this might be a good conversation for a lot of people right now because I worry about that study on multiple levels. One, that the researchers didn't take care in the interpretation of the data, but also that other researchers didn't jump in to correct the misinterpretation.
Mm-hmm.
I actually want to introduce an idea called the Simpson's paradox. And I don't know if you saw my discussion about the Simpsons paradox
Yep.
In our online community, but I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick because I've got a spreadsheet set up here. This is these are just numbers that I made up, but let's say that early on during the pandemic, you had three different types of hospitals administering hydroxychloroquine differently, and hospital one treats everybody with hydroxychloroquine the moment they move into the hospital. I'm going to oversimplify this, but it'll make the point. The oversimplification won't matter much. You've got a second hospital that only treats people if they are severe cases, which is what a number of people were suggesting. Like this is compassionate use was the phrase they would use, right? So we're not going to try it on people who aren't very sick. We're just going to try it on the people who, we don't know what else we might be able to do. They're not getting better. And then you have a third type of hospital, which gives no hydroxychloroquine at all. And, if you look at these numbers, and these are fabricated numbers. This is not real data. I'm just, making a point here, but there's definitely hospital data that doesn't look much different than this. Let's say, of the 1,000 people who are admitted at, stage 3 COVID in severity, let's say that everybody is admitted in stage 3 COVID. 1,000 people, half of them progress to stage 4. 60% of those progress to stage 5. So we've got 300 people left, and so on and so on, and 90 of those people to stage 8, which is death. And this is on the 8-point ordinal scale that's defined by the WHO. So, if this hospital is giving everybody here, maybe only 90%, 90 people, 9%, pass away. Whereas in hospital 2, people aren't treated here. And so more of them progress to stage 4, and, twice as many of them may have progressed to stage 5, and then they are treated. at that point. And from there, 180 of them die. So 18% of those 1,000 patients may have passed away at that point. And then you've got hospital 3, where you've got 1,000 people, and it's progressing the same as hospital 2 at first, right? Because nobody's getting any treatment, but they continue to not get treatment, and let's say 23% of them expire. So if you look at this data and you say, hey, we're going to do a study and analyze what proportion of the patients who received hydroxychloroquine died and what proportion of those who didn't died, here are the numbers, right? Because these 270 deaths all go in the HCQ category, but only 1,600 of the patients were treated, and you get a 16.9% mortality rate. Whereas if you take these 400 people up here, 1,000 minus 600 who were not treated, and add them to these 1,000, you have 400 people over here who by definition did not die. By definition, they just got better without medication, but they are thrown into the category of people who did not receive hydroxychloroquine. And if we measure that way, it looks like hydroxychloroquine did worse, but there's absolutely no way that's true when we look hospital to hospital. And so this is called the Simpson's paradox. It's where you have a variable trend that becomes reversed when you cut the data in a certain way that weights it to advantage the group that it should not. Basically, I'm that's not the best way to say it, but I'm just going to say it quickly for the purpose of this conversation. It can flip the result. It doesn't have to, but it can. And so I created numbers where it did here. And this is not actually all that different from what happened in the VA study. The VA study was a little bit more severe than this, actually. But and then if you were to take a number of hospital, actually, I'm going to show how we could reanalyze this. If we said, hey, this is a HCQ hospital and this is an HCQ hospital, and we throw all those patients in the HCQ treatment plan category, meaning that if they did progress far enough that it would be used, then they're counted as being within that treatment plan, which is a better way to analyze the data. Now we see 13.5% versus 23%. We see hydroxychloroquine clearly doing better. Mm-hmm. Even this is not good enough, though, because we see over here, hospital 1, this is best practices. Between these 3 groups, it should be 9% to 23%. It should be a 61% drop in mortality, but here it would only be a 41% drop in mortality. And so we really have to break these down into just completely separate categories to see what's going on. But what happens in a number of the studies that showed hydroxychloroquine not doing quite as well, this was the case. If you had broken them up into these types of groups, you would have seen a very clear advantage to those who were receiving hydroxychloroquine. At least it appears that way as far as I could tell with the data, but they kind of washed the numbers together. They didn't necessarily present us with exact severity scores. It was too hard to disentangle the data to do a complete reanalysis, though there was one study where a reanalysis was done and it was very quickly censored from the internet. There was an article that showed up on Medium that showed this type of reanalysis for the Rosenberg study out of New York. It showed that if you took the patients who were only treated, as critical care, and you said, okay, let's assume that hydroxychloroquine doesn't do anything for people who are in critical condition. Let's assume it has 0 advantage. I actually think it has a slight advantage from the data that I've seen, but let's assume that it doesn't, because if I say there's a slight advantage, we've already answered the question. We should be using it. So let's say no advantage at all. Then we should take those people and put them not on the side of having been treated by hydroxychloroquine. Really, those people were deaths that were kind of smuggled over to the other side of the ledger. And if you reevaluate under that interpretation, then those who received hydroxychloroquine actually did much better than those who did not. Mm-hmm. So, it's the type of, this is something, though, where there are a lot of biostatisticians. There are a lot of people who look at these numbers, anytime a study like this is published, somebody competent should be doing this type of analysis. And I know from my own reading of papers, I've read thousands of scientific papers. I know that it very often it does not happen. In fact, I would say it usually does not. But the problem has been pointed out for years, and it seems like I don't know. It seems like an obtuse, um, like a tool that's there for potential manipulation.
Well, yeah, but I don't think you see. I have some math background, but nothing compared with yours. You think in terms of numbers. As a writer, I think in terms of motivations and people and how they reach conclusions. And once they've reached a conclusion, then they will cling to it. It's in human nature to cling to something that you've arrived at and resist someone who just comes along and says, oh, actually, there's an error in your numbers here. You're going to have a problem there right away. I learned about the possibility of hydroxychloroquine being useful back in February from my friend who does laboratory work. And I consulted my MD, who is very open-minded. And she said, sure, she would write a prescription. And at that time, he was still allowed to because the governor of Arizona had not stopped it. And the only question in my mind was, did I have a QT interval, which would make it at all risky for me to take it? So I thought, okay, I'll go to a cardiologist. But that was when the fun started, because the cardiologist had already made up his mind. And in fact, he became angry at the thought of me using this widely available drug, even if I was diagnosed with COVID-19. He was still angry about it. And there was no getting around this. He presented me with the studies I'd already seen, which I had already found problems with for similar reasons to the one you just described.
Oh, can you give me a date on that? Like, by the time you saw.
Well, wait a minute. By the time I saw him, you see, I had to go through many hoops in order to get where I wanted to go. First of all, they wanted to give me a cardio stress test. And so I didn't see him till around April, I guess, something like that. So we ended up having an unpleasant argument, and he wrote a nasty letter to my doctor saying, you should never have recommended this drug. And the basic truth of the matter, which is it's very widely prescribed and not significantly dangerous compared to many other medications, which are even over the counter, that all got lost in this anger at something which he felt was just wrong. And I never did succeed in changing his mind. Well, I was just a patient as far as he was concerned. And at one point, he got quite agitated and said, Mr. Platt, this is science. This is science. And I said, no, it's medicine. It's not quite the same thing. But of course, that just made things worse. So that's, I think, if you sort of expand that and extrapolate that to people all over the world having similar reactions of, no, this is wrong, and getting angry and very, very resistant to reconsidering at all. Reconsidering doesn't happen much these days. So that's my outlook on it. I don't really know where the obfuscation or the possible incompetence or people not looking at the numbers, I don't know what's really going on. But whatever it is, it's certainly affecting a lot of decisions.
Yeah. I want to speak to that in just a moment. But before we do, I'm going to point out that, there's this website, and I know that you know about it, but, many people might not. But there's this website, c19study.com, that keeps track of everything, going back to even like, evidence from, the 1800s that might relate. But it mostly starts with, the 2004 and 2005 studies by Carrots and Vincent that showed promise of chloroquine in vitro, and but it keeps track of all the studies, either published or in preprint. And I kind of wish that it would order itself in two ways, because I know that the ordering has changed as studies were published later. So there might be some that were in preprint around here, but then they got published in July or May or something. So they moved up the list and date. And I kind of wish I could, point out when it was that the exact timeline of all the evidence coming out, but right around here it is. China decided that they had seen enough evidence from their patients to adopt a chloroquine protocol standard across the board. Even before that, I think it was February 12th, South Korea adopted a hydroxychloroquine protocol. So that was already going on in February, right? There wasn't really, so much in studies except that, the Chinese health authorities said, we did a whole bunch of trials, like 15 clinical trials, and they still haven't published them all, sadly, right? We don't have our hands on that data, but they said we've seen enough to make this our protocol, and it's still their protocol, right? 9 months later, that is still their protocol, is to use chloroquine on patients. In the meantime, I guess the real evidence began coming out. It's just tiny little bits of the Chinese conversation or data. Though there was this one study that came out of China, and some people have questioned whether or not this study was real, or it wasn't particularly meaningful. Though some people like Bloomberg, posted an article that said this study was like negative for chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, but really and truly, like there were 30 patients, none of them died. And depending on what you're measuring, if you look at the two groups, one of them did a little bit better in some things, and one of them did a little bit better in other things, right? Like depending on whether you're talking about, PCR tests or symptoms, it just, it's very small. It wasn't particularly meaningful, but it got thrown out there as evidence a little bit. But I think it got
Matthew, I want to interrupt you here just on
Sure.
a matter of using this Zoom connection. At my end, I don't know whether it's lack of resolution on your webcam or on my screen, but the text is not legible. And when you scroll, I think you're online right now. When you scroll, it interferes with your audio a little, just for your future information.
Okay, understood. Yeah, I've recorded a few of these Zoom conversations before, and it seemed to go pretty well. But I will try for your benefit to improve this a little bit. Maybe I'll. Is this making my screen more readable for you?
No.
Okay. Well, I'll do my best to let you know what I'm talking about when I am. But that was, very early March that research was released. In the meantime, we're hearing about, anecdotally, a number of nations beginning to use hydroxychloroquine. There was a doctor, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but Lacona or something like that in Italy, when their hospitals were overflowing, he and two technicians went out and just started treating people in their homes. And if I recall correctly, they treated maybe it was 180 patients, 5% of them were hospitalized and none of them died. Or maybe it was 300 patients. I can't remember, but it was in Time Magazine, I think. Other places it was reported on. So Italy started using it, and Costa Rica consulted with China. They started using it, and some of the Chinese doctors went to Italy also. So China was out, doing, in a sense, chloroquine diplomacy. Whereas this is a point. I guess it was March 19th, and this is one of the things that I focus on in trying to understand the situation. March 19th was Trump's press conference, right? I think it was a week before that, Dr. James Todaro he put up like a 15-page document in GDocs showing what the evidence to date was. And there was a little bit more than you can see here because I think some of, that was in preprint, is published at later dates. But he just talked about the history of it, talked about how safe it was and this and that. Google censored that document on March 18th, the day before Trump's press conference. And this seems very weird to me. The day before that, March 17th, was the day that University of Minnesota announced its first randomized control trial headed by David Boulware. So that was March 17th. In my searches on Google, going back to the appropriate date ranges, there is nothing about either one of these things. Not one single member of the press interviewed David Boulware, so far as I could tell. Not one member of the American press had spoken about Dr. Raoult's experiments, and he was already giving interviews.
Mhm.
I saw at least 2 interviews online. The Russian Times interviewed him, but nobody in the U.S. press did. So if you heard Trump speak on March 19th and you got online and you Googled for this, what you would have found is nothing, essentially.
Mhm.
You might have found some guy talking in French and otherwise almost no information, but there were conversations happening. Um, there were conversations happening on Reddit, on Twitter. None of the journalists were picking these up and taking them. Hospitals were ordering mass supplies in the week from March 10th to March 17th. Hospitals ordered so much that when people talked about the scarcity and they pointed at Trump, they said, "Oh, there are pharmacies that are running out of stock."
Mhm.
And from what I've gathered from every, I followed those lines a little bit, trying to figure out what actually happened, and it was clear that there wasn't any kind of mass shortage, as in, sure, pharmacies might run out one day and they could get more very quickly. It's
Mhm.
not like, there was like a complete supply chain pull problem. Um, but, it was hospitals all over the country had been ordering stocks, and nobody in the press was reporting this. Nobody was asking why or talking with doctors. So in an internet search, it seems like the press was intentionally silent up to the point when Trump mentioned it. So I
Mm.
find this to be very, very unsettling.
Yeah, it's very hard to infer motives. When I became a journalist relatively late in life, I had been a fiction writer previously. I became a journalist and I thought, wow, these people went to Columbia School of Journalism. They're going to know exactly how it's really done. And I'm going to be in trouble here because I'm still learning. And it was a very disillusioning experience, like so many experiences where you enter a field with high expectations and then you realize how it's really done. They're very lazy, and laziness explains a lot of what you see in journalism because they like to work from a press release. They don't like to have to think of questions on their own. They've been told what the angle of the story is from their editor, and they just want to go home and file the story and go on to the next one. So I'm always a little bit dubious about inferring motives of journalists who are actually writing the stories. Now, the news organizations is another matter. And they have to think much more about where their money comes from, where they get their clicks, their advertising. And there I'm more willing to see bad motives, shall we say. But don't ever discount laziness because that really explains a lot. And I saw Dr. Fauci, is that how his name is pronounced?
I think so.
Saying hydroxychloroquine, the evidence is all anecdotal. And it became clear he had not actually seen the original French report. And he didn't even have people working for him who were supposed to go online and dig stuff up like that. He just didn't know. He was making it up in a way that suggested to me he was just dismissing it because it was irrelevant and he was annoyed. And that was another instance of someone whose mind was made up, and I don't think he ever retracted that at all, did he?
No, no, not as far as I can tell. And of course, the FDA is, seems to have very staunchly opposed it. At this point, they had, for a little while, they made it easier, maybe for about 2 months. But after that, they pretty much said, well, we've seen nothing, and it seemed like they were pointing at a very one-sided picture of the evidence when, in fact, there were many studies coming out that looked positive. And of course, there was Dr. Raoult's study, right?
Yeah.
And it was rushed, right? And I think, and I may talk about this another time, but I think he rushed the study, partially because I think that he believed that already that there was going to be a campaign against it.
Hmm.
And I won't go into the reasons right now. I talk about this some in my book, and maybe I'll do this in a future talk with somebody else. But there's so many things that we can cover. But he rushed his study. It was originally going to be 14 days, and he stopped after 6.
Right.
and he published through a journal that was run by one of his co-authors. And it's a very weird thing. Yeah, this looks bad in many ways, right? And in his pre-print, he did not have all of the data that later appeared in the published study, which looks like a rush job. Some people said, oh, this is fudging the numbers, or they implied that it could be, right? Of course, when 2 months later, when he had treated 4,000 patients, they just kind of shut up about it, but they never went back to him. It seems like they were motivated to stack the deck against him, and they didn't completely describe who he was. So one thing, for anybody listening now who doesn't really know Dr. Ayle's story, I'm going to give a brief summary of it right here. He was, French Senegalese. His grandfather was a doctor. His father, I can't remember what I read about that, but there was medicine in the family. He grew up, traipsing around the jungles of a different country, and wasn't a particularly good student. So, but he was a reader. I guess he read a lot of books. He went and joined the French Merchant Marine at some point, and after that, came out and was like, no, I want to do something other than that. So he got interested in medicine and got into medical school in Marseille through his literature scores, exam scores. But once he was there, I guess he dove right in. He has discovered around 500 different human-borne microbes. And just to give an idea of what that means, there are only about 2,500 known. So that's about a fifth of all the human-borne microbes. And I say he, and I'm sure that that's a group effort with other researchers also around him. But that's the point, is that he did so much work. He was kind of the practical adventurer, as opposed to the person climbing through the ranks with, perfect high school record and scores and saying, where am I going to go where I'm going to get the most money first? He seemed to be more the adventurer type. And I think that bothers a lot of the people, within the institutions. And that he succeeded so broadly. He discovered, he was the first discoverer of the giant virus, the gyrus. He discovered cures for Whipple's disease. I don't know, cures or treatments, Whipple disease and Q fever. And he's written treatments for about a dozen different diseases, if I understand correctly. And some of those, Q fever and Whipple's disease, he treated with hydroxychloroquine once he figured out the bacteria that was associated with causing the condition. So he was very, very familiar with the drug, right? And when he saw, I guess it was the 2005 paper, that the in vitro study by, Vincent, when he saw that, I think he wrote his own paper. I don't know if it's listed. I don't think it's listed here, but he wrote a 2007 paper talking about how, things like this suggest to us that we should be looking at hydroxychloroquine first as like the greatest weapon in medicine in the 21st century, because here it is, it treats, it's antifungal, it's antibacterial. There's a lot of evidence that it's antiviral. I think that it was used as a treatment in some poor countries for HIV, in fact, which is very, very interesting, which makes sense. If you can't afford as many expensive medicines, then here's something, right? And if it slows down the virus, then, you've saved some life. But it has at least in vitro effects on, I think, at least 10 different viruses. So, he looked at that and said, this is awesome. We should be looking at this the next time the next coronavirus comes out. So the moment he saw that China was using it, he was, proposing this, and nobody in the Western media was paying attention to him at all. And I find it weird. Well,
he had a record in other respects, which I think made some people immediately prejudiced towards him a little bit. I mean, he'd said, apparently, I haven't read the original source, but apparently he expressed some skepticism about some aspect of climate change. And people immediately seized upon that. Oh, well, he's a climate skeptic, so we can't believe anything he said. And once you get labeled that way, it's very hard to recover.
Yeah, I think that's a great lesson for the moment now, which is One, forgive anybody for being wrong about something if they are,
Mhm.
right? I mean, two, it's not all the world's scientists who are quite sure of the exact same opinion on climate scientists. There's really a range of opinions and a range on beliefs of the severity. And we should always assume that scientists are going to make new discoveries, look at things from different angles. But yeah, that labeling, I think that might have even been in people's pockets earlier to come out and label him that way.
Yeah.
And he had conflict with the head of INSERM, and
Right.
INSERM is like the US NIH, and I think has more publications than any national organization like that except the NIH. So they're a very large science organization. And the CEO of INSERM had moved to take away Raoult's research independence. And for all the UHIs, those are the University Hospital, I'm not sure exactly how you say it, but yeah, the medical research institutions in France. So he was butting heads with Yves Levy, who was the head of INSERM and whose wife was the Minister of Health in France. And that turns out to be its own interesting story. And it gives me some insight into why it is possible that that he was attacked so hard and is still attacked. And I don't know if you know this, but he's not being allowed to treat some patients now.
Really.
They took away his freedom to do that in France, and that's at least last I heard. This today is November 19th, but that was my last understanding. But on October 8th of 2019, Agnes Buzyn, who was Yves Levy's wife, was the Minister of Health and started the paperwork to take hydroxychloroquine off of being an over-the-counter medication after decades of it being freely available just over the counter to the French public. And I think it was October 13th, the she signed off on making the UHIs, including Raoult's facility, no longer independent in its research. So that was late 2019. And of course, there have been like satellite photos analyzed from Wuhan, suggesting that the hospitals were receiving very high traffic in September.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about Ave Levy is that when he became head of INSERM in 2014, he ushered in the completion of the level 4, the first mainland Chinese level 4 biohazard facility at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That was done with counsel and expertise from France. They have their own level 4 biohazard in Lyons. How do you say that? But if anybody had been in a position to know about something like a virus leak from a lab or a viral outbreak in Wuhan, would have been him.
Mhm.
So, I think that Dr. Raoult had a sense that they knew,
Mhm.
and he wanted to get the research out as quickly as possible in order to make noise. And then, of course, you know, he publishes. Google looks over and sees Dr. James Tadaro's document on hydroxychloroquine and censored it, I think, for several months.
Mhm.
And the next day, Trump speaks, and any Americans getting online find almost no information.
Well,
So,
there's no doubt if I was still writing journalism now for Wired magazine, and if the editorial policy was still the same, I would be on a plane to France. There's absolutely no doubt. But that kind of journalism is not done very often, and it costs money, takes time, and there's always the risk of then the publication gets labeled as being credulous or
far right.
circulating falsehoods, when in fact you're trying to do exactly the opposite. You're trying to get both sides of the story and present it in a careful and formally correct way. But that in itself raises red flags to people because you're not necessarily on board with whatever the current status quo is. It's a real problem.
So I'm going to throw this up here now. I'm going to take a different page. Of course, there are all these different studies that have come out, and some positive and some negative, but over time, far, far more positive than negative. But these studies mean different things, and this is one of the big pieces that has frustrated me all along, which is that Oops, about to show you my financial data. One thing that has frustrated me all along is that the early treatment studies were so uniformly positive. And with one or two exceptions, yeah, there was the trial that came out. Well, there was the Mitcha study on nasopharyngeal swabs, like viral load, right? And it would have taken just a tremendous number of people for that to reach statistical significance. And I'm not a fan of p equals 0.05 as statistical significance. I'm a fan of just saying, this is what the p-value is, and let's describe as completely as possible what happened, right? I think that's the way science should always be reported. But the one that a lot of people pointed to that came out was, oh, where is it? Oh, the Skipper trial. That was the second University of Minnesota randomized control trial, which came out as p equals 0.19. And you can actually measure different things in that study. There are, lower p values, meaning that the group that received hydroxychloroquine did better. But it was also true that they didn't use a placebo that we know to be inert. They used folate. And so, all the people who, and just for anybody who doesn't know, folate is given to pregnant women, and pregnant women have been to the hospital in much, much lower numbers. And in fact, in two different reports in two different countries, pregnant women were being admitted for COVID at a 90% reduced rate,
Hmm. Wow.
suggesting that folate is possibly very, very helpful for
Mhm.
COVID. And it's amazing that we don't hear more about this, because that sounds like a medication that we should maybe be giving people immediately, if not encouraging people to take it as a supplement. There's, it doesn't seem to me, at least, like there's a good reason not to. But so this wasn't even really a study of hydroxychloroquine versus inert placebo. It was a study of hydroxychloroquine versus folate. But there's only just a couple of these that could even really be called into question. But the early treatment studies are just so uniformly positive. And it seems very strange to me that within the scientific community, there are people who don't understand, this sort of basic logic of, if you prove that something doesn't work for critical patients, that doesn't mean that it doesn't work for people early on. That you really just have to prove that it works, or not prove. That's not even the right word, because that's not a statistics word. It's not a science word. All you have to do is come to a good conclusion that it's likely a good thing in any one place. But the proposed mechanism for hydroxychloroquine was that it acted as an antiviral. It has these other properties. It is antithrombotic. It is immunomodulatory. It helps with cytokine storms, which is why they use it for a lot of autoimmune patients, like 15 different autoimmune disorders, just that I cataloged while I was doing research. But in particular, if this acts as an antiviral, what you should expect is for this to happen, to work best when given early, or when given as prophylaxis. And so, the VA study was a, late or very late stage fail. The Rosenberg study, late or very late, fail. If you just, you know, if you just look at the early treatment evidence, it's just so overwhelming. Really, the whole evidence is overwhelming at this point. The p-value is in the, one in billions and billions. But it's hard to understand why it is that people would be citing the evidence from late stage studies, right? It just seems like
It's impossible for me to understand, and always has been. It was almost perverse that they would do that. But I can't believe they were kind of all collaborating in some way to decide on that. They had been trained in some way to think in these terms or something like that, but it made no sense at all.
yeah, I still have a very hard time. I personally, I do at this point believe there were motivations. I think I changed in a more negative perspective two or
Mhm.
three times throughout. The big one for me, which I brought up early, was the Surgisphere study, because when I looked at that, I could not imagine that there weren't. I don't know. I couldn't imagine that other people wouldn't immediately have questions about it. And when I looked at the way the science journalists who came out talking about it, including people I think of as fake science journalists. There was a guy who's a nutritionist at Harvard who was like a visiting nutritionist who went out on Twitter and was talking about the virus every day like he was a Harvard expert,
Mhm.
maybe in virology, even though he didn't. I'm not even going to say his name because a bunch of people at Harvard complained about him after a while. But he went through and detailed all the stuff, but he showed some of the statistics, and it was like, why would you accept that at face value? How could anyone who's ever done science accept some of these numbers at face value? They're just so wild. And, that suggested to me that things were, that there was at least a lot going on that was deliberate.
Mhm.
And of course, the review process is black box. We'll never know who reviewed those papers. And, why is it that those guys are being protected? Why isn't there a serious fraud investigation? But, here are, the other thing that a lot of people talk about are the randomized control trials. Like, you need randomized control trials. Like, if you have observation studies that go over, tens of thousands of patients, and we do at this point, right? I've put a lot of the 100 something studies that are out into spreadsheets and, tallied up the total number of patients. It's a 6-digit number at this point from these observational randomized control trial, prospective studies, all the different types of studies that have been done. Even if you take out the randomized control trials, it's a 6-digit number. And that is enough data to power high levels of certainty. And a lot of people don't know this, but the guy who came up with the statistical framework by which these studies are judged, right? He did so before the existence of randomized control trials.
Mhm. Mhm.
And he told us, his name was Ronald Fisher, and he was a British statistician. He told us, this is what we're doing. We're imagining, how uncommon this result or a more extreme one would be by random chance. And you can do that with any type of study.
Mhm.
And it takes fewer patients to get to a certain power level, right, with a randomized control trial. Certainly true. No one argues that. But you go back into the literature, and there are numerous authors who take a look at observational studies versus randomized trials and go, well, look, we don't really see difference, and we see terrible health policy based on this historically. But randomized control trials really have kind of a sweet spot where they make a difference. A few hundred patients, if you only have a few hundred patients to make a decision, or you want to know where it is that some very serious side effect happens so you can dodge that subgroup, right? These are the places where randomized control trials shine. But so, we had all these people saying randomized control trials, but they clearly weren't even keeping track of them because most of them were positive too. There were a few, once again, that did not reach statistical significance. Here's Bulware, here's Mitcha, Skipper. But there were so many of them that if you put them together, they went way beyond statistical significance a while back. They were definitely heading in that direction the whole time.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's been very frustrating having conversations, online about these because it seemed like there was a planted talking point to just say, randomized control trials, randomized control trials, randomized control trials, and to talk about studies like Bulware and Skipper, both of which involve that placebo, that folate placebo, but to talk about those studies as if they were failures for hydroxychloroquine, when the truth is, as far as I understand that I read from their discussions, those trials were cut short because the first wave was over,
Mhm.
right? They just weren't going to have as many participants.
Exactly.
And if
Mhm.
they did have as many participants, both of them, if they kept going in this direction, would have been statistically significant results. But
Well, it seems to me your challenge now, you have accumulated such a huge amount of information. Your challenge now is to organize it and present it in a way which doesn't overwhelm people. And that's a big challenge.
yeah, it is a challenge. For anybody viewing right now, what Charles is referring to is that I'm working on a book, and I'm going to do one of those things that people probably should not do, which is show a peek of what's going on. And it is a very difficult and challenging book to write. And I don't really care if people try to screen capped this to see some of it. Some of the chapters are more complete than others, but I try to go through the logic of what it is that we're looking for. It's not very well formatted yet. What it is that we're looking for, what types of evidence there are, and lay it out without any politics at first. Right. That's my goal. I've got 4 parts of the book. The first one is, mostly talking about the drugs and the virus and the safety profile. Right. I want to go ahead and let people know this thing has had a impeccable safety profile for decades. It really is true. There are a lot of things, non-steroid pain relievers have a worse health profile.
Mhm.
you know, are you taking ibuprofen too much? That may be a bad idea. But this has been a very safe drug. I think it has a fifth of the estimated mortality rate of the average medicine prescribed.
Mm.
I think that's the number that I came up with in my computations. Maybe it was a third, maybe it was a fifth, but a fraction. Then I'm going to go into national analysis, which is to take a look at the results from all over the world where people have been using it to various degrees, and ask the question, what do their deaths per million look like? And this is my data as of late October. Yes, mixed, no, world. There are some countries where the light green, where we just don't have information, or I haven't found information, but I found information for nearly every country on earth at this point. And talk about possible confounders. Unfortunately, that's going to be a difficult chapter to finish, because there's so many things that people throw in. And I feel like almost like it's a game, like they look for something to explain why the countries using hydroxychloroquine are doing better. And they say, oh, it's because in Asia, they know how to use masks better.
Yeah. Well,
Tell me about the Middle East. They have like the lowest case fatality rate in the world. So I go through some research to try that there. Then I go through all of the studies. And when I say go through all the studies, some of them in serious detail, others of them sort of in groups,
mhm,
and talk about the vitamins, because they matter a lot more than people have been told, I think.
mhm,
Vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, folate, selenium, all, and others have all been found to have positive effects, at least in some studies. Talk about immunity, herd immunity, and then I'm going to get into what I call the propaganda wars, and that's where it becomes a very complicated picture. But I think that what we've seen is something like an Asch conformity experiment, where if you get enough people to first say this is bad, then you're going to have a lot of people follow suit,
right,
maybe without thinking. And in the Asch conformity experiment, there were a number of different reasons why. Some of it was to avoid social punishment. Some of
mhm,
it was to seek social reward, but some of it was also true distortion of perception. If 8 people before you said line B is the same length, and it's not, you might actually start believing that it is.
yep, yep.
So I think that that's a lot of what's happened. But we've been talking for an hour, and I'm going to ask you one more question, and maybe we can wrap things up, or
That would be good.
any thoughts that you have. I'm happy to talk about, though. But did you see the Senate hearing today?
No.
There was a Senate hearing on outpatient treatment.
Oh,
And I worry that this Senate hearing is going to just be buried, that basically no one will know what was said, that there was not any real coverage of it. There was not any, import given to it, despite the fact that we're in this pandemic, and early treatment seems to be the most obvious place to focus if there's any chance that it works,
right.
if not prophylaxis. Um, and all over the subcontinent, India, they're using both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, millions and millions of people, seemingly effectively, as prophylaxis. But I worry that because of the state of things, that essentially, they got Dr. Harvey Reish from Yale.
Yep.
They had Dr. McCullough. They had some good people up there, defending the notion. But I'm afraid that they did nothing for presentation, right? And that what people need to see a lot of is, the total summary of the data. This was fantastic work done by a group of scientists who has remained anonymous at this point, but who also organized all these studies. People who have been published in Nature and Cell, very serious, good researchers. But I didn't see anything like that in this conversation, on the Senate floor. So I think that it's going to be nothing. It's not going to change the game at all. But I wanted to know if you'd seen it, and I wanted to know your opinion if you had.
No, I haven't absorbed much news today, as it happens. I've been writing a book of my own, and that's taking most of my attention. And then, of course, there's the political stuff, which is becoming surreal. It's a very odd time for a former journalist who I used to think of myself as a little bit out there. Like I would look into subjects which other people dismiss, but now the world is becoming so surreal that I'm beginning to feel conventional by comparison.
Yeah. How do you think the election's going to go? Oh, the Seidel server. Should we call it Schrodinger's Seidel server?
When you have a former assistant, what was she? Assistant district attorney. She was federal, I believe. Anyway, when you have this woman going on at a press conference saying that there's a multinational conspiracy, not just a conspiracy within the United States, it's getting surreal. It's becoming like a Philip K. Dick novel. Very strange.
Yeah, hopefully the script writers will get a little more boring soon.
We hope there's a happy ending. But meanwhile, I'm just trying not to get infected and waiting for my dose of whatever drug du jour, which is going to be supposedly immunize me. We'll see, won't we?
So what's your next book on?
Well, I'm doing 2 or 3 different things at once, actually, but they're mostly about electronics in some shape or form. That's the thing which I seem to be best at explaining, so that's what I ended up doing. And this way I don't have to get on airplanes and go to strange parts of the world at short notice and try to get people to talk to me who may not really want to talk to me, and then have to go home and write a story about it. That was interesting, but quite hard.
Well, go ahead and plug one of your books. You told me that one of them outsold the others.
Yeah, the one that does very well, it's sold more than 200,000 copies in the United States alone, is called Make Electronics. And it's an introductory level, and it disproves the widely believed notion in the publishing business that, oh, people don't read anymore. Well, my book has 120,000 words in it, and people read it. So my conclusion is that if it contains information that they want, they will read. And that's what I'm basing my retirement income on.
Well, good luck with your next book, projects, I guess, plural is what it sounds like, and best health to you. Thanks so much for joining me. Yeah, I'm gonna run 3 or 4 of these, I think, with different people to talk about the hydroxychloroquine controversy, which I will call the Chloroquine Wars, which is going to be the name of the book as I publish it. But I really, I know that you'd paid a lot of attention to it early and throughout. And so I appreciate you talking with me. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Good luck with your book.
Thank you.